What's up, YouTube? I'm the Nice One, and it has been a minute since we last talked, but I'm super glad to be getting back into my character modeling stuff. Today we're making Phoenix King Aenarion, or Prince Tyrion, from the Warhammer fantasy universe, particularly the old world fantasy universe, for those of you who are into that. I started playing the 1995 board game, and that really inspired me to get back into my character modeling journey because each of those characters are so unique and have so much lore behind them. So I can't wait to make each of those classes. If you watch the video here, you should be able to make it yourself, but I will post all these STL files online for you to download so you can print it yourself with your own resin printers. And it's just a small way for you to support your channel if you like what I'm doing. Anyway, we'll be starting with the head today, so check the chapter titles for different sections. As always, leave any comments or questions you have, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, let's get started here on making a Phoenix King Aenarion character for Warhammer Quest. What you see me doing here at the very beginning is making a 25mm base. So for those of you who are like into miniatures and sort of like the tabletop gaming, you all know 25mm is one of the sizes of the bases you can get. You go up to like 30, 32, heroic, all these different sizes. But the main reason I'm making this base at the beginning is so that every model after that is to scale and fits the base itself. So now what you see here is I put in a block and I cut it in half using the Control R function, and I applied a mirror modifier. Mirror modifier allows you to modify one end of an object and then have that modification happen exactly the same on the opposite side. So here what you're looking at is, as I'm modeling the head of this miniature, I only really need to do one half of it. It saves me a lot of time, and it makes sure everything is symmetrical. So that's basically what I'm doing here at this point. I'm shaping out the basic proportions of the model's head, and I know my style is generally sort of like blocky style. And what you saw there actually is I dropped in a subdivision modifier. What the subdivision does is it takes a block and then basically adds faces to it such that it rounds out and looks a little more natural and smooth. And you can apply this modifier without actually having it affect the model. So I'm technically modeling the underlying box, but I'm previewing what would happen once I've actually applied the subdivision modifier. Now that I'm happy with the shape of the head, generally, for proportions, I'm starting to make the helmet here, right? And I'm using the same sort of technique that I did with the head. Using a mirror modifier after taking a basic plane and cutting it directly in half. That way I can, again, just model on one side and have my changes happen exactly the same on the opposite so that it's perfectly symmetrical. For most character modeling, I highly recommend learning the mirror modifier function. I'll post that later if you really care, but it's super simple, to be honest with you. And now at this point, I'm making the helmet, right? I'm using that underlying mesh, that underlying box, to guide how I want this helmet to fit around the guy's head, right? And I'm using a plane to make it's almost like I'm taking a piece of paper and sort of crumpling it and folding it in such a way that it would make the layer of a helmet over someone's face. And my main reason for doing this is because in the future, I know that I'm going to use another function called the extrude. And basically, extrude takes flat planes, and extends it out to make a thicker shape, essentially. So that's why here, what I'm focusing on is getting the right silhouette and the right sort of what I want the ultimate helmet to really look like, front view and side views, and which is why I'm modifying each of the underlying vertices and moving them around to positions that I think look good, And I'll be super honest with you at this point, I don't really have any reference art, honestly, and a lot of this is just me messing around and trying to imagine how I want this helmet's proportions to look like, and kind of like how I imagine someone's head to fit in the helmet, right? So what you're going to see a lot of is just me moving around particular vertices into what I think is a good position and what looks right for someone's forehead, where their nose would probably be, where their eyes would be, and making a general silhouette. And Personally, one of my biggest things when I'm making these character models is I want them to have a very distinct silhouette. I want them... imagine if you put a black texture over everything and don't see any detail. You can still sort of tell what kind of character it is because it has such a unique shape, a unique outline around it. And so I'm focusing very much on what this helmet face looks like, because once I extrude it, it'll have that thickness, like as if it's actually made of metal. Now what you're seeing here is at the top, in order to join all the vertices, I filled it using F function. And that basically fills in all of the empty space between any selected edges. And what you saw me do is use the cutting tool, the slicer tool, in order to cut that filled face so that it was not a face that had like 100 edges, right? I cut it so that it would have at least 4 edges, or better 3, because generally Blender has an easier time calculating a face when it only has 3 points or 3 edges. So that's what I was doing earlier there, using the cut function at the top of the helmet. Now I'm going back in and just like really fine-tuning the shape of the helmet to be like as close as I want it to be. I highly recommend when you're doing this to just block it out, right? Just do general shapes at first until you get like a vision or a sense of what you want. And then you can go back in and like really be specific and really tweak it to your liking, right? But generally start like lo-fi, start rough, and then add in the detail after that. Now, what I'm going to be doing is, honestly, I just spent a lot of time tweaking the shape of the face here. And I wish I could like post a video for y'all where it's like, this is what we'll do step 1, this is what we'll do step 2. But it's not usually like that when I'm making these things. But here, what you're seeing is what I talked about earlier, the extrusion. So selecting all the faces, even with the mirror modifier applied, if I extrude, it adds that thickness to the helmet that you want when you're talking about metal armor. And now what I added is an additional subdivision modifier, kind of like what I talked about with the head, the actual like biological head underneath, to really smooth out those faces so it's not too sharp. And now, as I've smoothed it out, what I'm doing here is a technique called, this is how you get really, really beautiful sharp edges around your model. So basically what I'm picking is, you see me selecting each of the edges around the helmet. So like the bottom edge, like maybe around the profile here, any place where I want like a sharp line to kind of indicate almost like metal structure. Like, you know, when someone like folds metal, it's usually pretty angular. What I'm doing here is I'm selecting those lines in the base mesh, and then I'm using Control B to initiate the bevel function. And what that does is it allows you to add basically edges to the selected edge. And the more edges you add, the sharper the line will be. So usually I bevel, I'll hit Control B and I'll scroll maybe 2 points so that I have about 2 edges between the top and bottom of the selected edge. And that's what gives you that really nice sharp line. So I highly recommend learning to do that, because when it comes to my character models, I use that literally all the time. It's incredible. It's an incredible tool, or it's just an incredible technique, really. Next up here, what I'm making is the next piece, which is sort of like I imagined as like a gem on this person's helmet. So what we're making, right, is the Phoenix King from Warhammer Quest. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's kind of like Warhammer. It's like a classic tabletop tabletop game where you just pretend to be a dwarf or like fantasy characters sort of thing. And so when I was looking up reference art for this particular character, I noticed that a lot of them had like this gem at the dead center of his helmet. And I thought maybe that gem was supposed to be very special to this particular character, so I want to represent that here. All I really did was took a box and did the same mirror modifier, cutting down the straight edge, and like just blocking out a general shape of what looked to be like a ruby or something. Next up, I'm starting to make the sort of feathers at the front of the helmet, sort of like kind of like a front plume around the brow and the forehead. Again, all the same techniques. I'm basically using blocking, mirror modifiers, and then modifying the underlying vertices to make the shape that I want. And also like obviously beveling to really sharpen out those edges, and subdivision surface modifiers to make it really smooth all around. And so here, that's what you're looking at, right? I have a subdivision applied to this feather. I have a mirror modifier applied to this feather so that I don't have to do both sides. And then I'm using the profile. So I hit 3 on my keyboard to see the perfect like side profile. I think it's the left profile. And then modifying the, like basically curving it around the helmet so that it looks like it's sort of bending down. And now what I'm trying to do is like down the center, I want it to be a little bit sharper, to kind of imply like an edge there. So I'm using the bevel technique. Actually, technically, I'm not really beveling down the center. What I'm doing is using Control R to make an edge loop, and I'm bringing that edge loop really close to the center line because I know when the mirror modifier will duplicate that edge loop, effectively creating like a bevel effect directly down the center. And now what you're looking at is, now that I have the first feather done, and I'm pretty happy with the general shape and kind of composition of it, I'm just going to duplicate the feather around this helmet. That way I don't have to like recreate it each time, right? Save yourself some work, save yourself some time by just using some of the assets you already made, especially if it doesn't matter too much how detailed or unique each asset will be. So yeah, I'm just copying each feather, and I know in my mind that it's okay to only do this on one half, because once I apply all of these modifiers like the mirror, the subdivision, I can then apply another mirror modifier on top of that to duplicate the entire mesh to the opposite side, so that again, I'm really only working on one half. Honestly, it's an incredible, like that saves me so much time. And I highly recommend learning how to do that. That's like the first thing you should learn how to do. Anyway, talking a little bit more about this, I'm just going to be kind of tweaking the positions of the feather until I'm happy. But yeah, recently I got really into Warhammer Quest. I've been really enjoying this sort of 1995 board game. For those of you who know that back in 95, they released what was sort of the first board game ever for this RPG sort of co-op game. And online, it's super expensive. Like, I think it's almost like 600, 500 USD. And I've been personally just making it myself, just going to like Staples and stuff, printing it all out. Because I do not want to pay that much for a board game. I'm sorry, that's a little over the top. But if you do, by all means, I wish I had that. Wish I had that cash. That'd be nice. But a lot of what inspired me to get back into this modeling stuff is because I'd love to create the characters in that board game exactly as they appear in the artwork, or just like how I imagine them, And like when I was looking online at Thingiverse and all these other places, I couldn't quite find what I was looking for. You know what I mean? Like it was close, but not exactly. And for those of you who are into this modeling stuff, I know you're probably like me, right? You're like, this is really good. I wish I could tweak this one thing or this and that. So I just decided I'll just make it myself. It's fine. But yeah, getting back into this modeling video here, not to blah blah at you. What you see me doing now is I'm adding edge loops. I'm using the cutting tool to add edge loops around the bottom edge of this helmet. Because what I want to do is I want to use the extrude function and make almost like a kind of like a trim. I want to make a trim on the helmet itself around the very bottom. And that's what you see me doing using the extrude function. I'm like extending out a small trim to kind of make it give it like a polished finish around the bottom edges. And now that I have this extrusion, I'm going to go in and click the edge loops where this sort of where this trim is supposed to be. And I'm going to, again, use the bevel function to sharpen out that edge, to really make it nice and crisp and make it look as if someone had like hammered that in or something, make it like a hard surface, right? Not too sort of blobby, which is not what you usually want when you're doing like armor modeling. At least personally, I like that sharp look to my helmet and stuff like that, and my armor. So again, just Control B. Select the edge loop that you want and hit Control B. Use your mouse, like literally move your mouse, and you'll see how far out the bevel goes. And then use your scroll wheel to see how many edge loops you want to add with the bevel. Now I'm just tweaking out a little bit of the eyes, give it a nice sort of, sharp eye look, kind of like a phoenix, kind of like a bird's eye. Again, this character is supposed to be like the Phoenix King in Warhammer Old World fantasy. And for those of you who don't know, I think he's supposed to represent like the king of the High Elves or something before some incredible calamity that like caused them to all be lost to the mist of time. So what I really want to capture in this helmet is that this is sort of the royal Phoenix King, Phoenix Lord, right? And so what I'm making here now, what you're looking at, is I'm making the actual Phoenix head, because at the top I want to add that like beautiful sculpted Phoenix head to represent sort of this character's origins. And to do that, very similar to how I did the helmet originally, instead of using a basic cube, I'm just dropping in a flat plane. I'm dropping in the plane, and I'm cutting an edge loop. I'm cutting it straight down the center using Control R. I'm deleting the left side vertices, and I'm applying a mirror modifier with clipping enabled, so that, again, I can just make one half of it without having to worry about the other half, and knowing that they're going to be perfectly symmetrical. So yeah, that's what you see me doing here right now. I'm just going to be taking the vertices individually and just positioning them where I want to kind of create I don't know how y'all imagine a phoenix head, but like sometimes I imagine them having like feathers framing out from their head to make kind of like a mane, like, I don't know if there's a bird in real life that does this. Maybe it's kind of like a peacock, actually. A peacock might be very similar. And now that I'm thinking about this character, the ultimate product, like how it ends up looking, it does kind of look like a peacock, if not for the colors. So maybe that could be some good real life inspiration. I highly recommend doing that, like just looking at photographs of things in the real world or just other people's artwork to get a sense of how other people think about it, and like proportions and like just like the divots and the indents. I never realized how important life drawing back in like high school would come in when it came to like modeling characters. Like I always thought that was just sort of a waste time kind of assignment, but it actually always comes in handy. I think about it all the time. But anyway, what I'm doing, again, like the helmet, is I'm making the front face of this phoenix. Now, what's kind of different about this is I am not going to use the extrusion modifier. My whole plan from the beginning of doing this head was I was going to just make the face just as planes, and just as planes, really. And then once I had the general shape of it down, I was going to try and use both the vertex merging tool, which is select two vertices and hit M and then merge at either the center or last, or using the shortcut F, which is the fill function, which allows me to, like I said earlier, fill in the face between two or more selected edges. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here. I'm adding the little beak now and making sure that the vertices are merged so that it encloses. Because what you don't want with these type of models is you don't want something called a manifold, or I guess it's a non-manifold mesh, which basically means it's a mesh that has an opening somewhere, such that if you were to like pour water into this mesh, it would leak out from that opening. It's like an incomplete mesh because there's an open face. That's what a non-manifold mesh is. Generally, when you're doing like 3D printing, for example, you want manifold meshes. You want them all to be enclosed so that the printer doesn't get confused when it's doing its layers and stuff. But if you're doing animation, like if your final result of this is a video, you might be able to get away with some open meshes, or just like flat planes. So just think about your use case. Here in this particular model, I'm going to be both using it as an animated character, but I'm also trying to make it in such a way that I could 3D print it for my board game. I'm just going to be simplifying this mesh a little bit by merging some of the some of the vertices here to get like a sharp lines where I want them to, to kind of imply the underlying skeleton. It's a little hard for me to describe, but what I want these base mesh to do is like generally make a shape that mimics the shape of a bird. And so you see how all these sort of edges are pointing towards the peak of the beak, right? That really helps create sort of a flow to this to these faces, and it makes it look almost like more realistic or like more believable, right? As opposed to them sort of just being all over the place. It's literally just moving vertices around. And one thing I really loved about this particular character, which is what really inspired me, is that he has this whole like backstory of being a sort of honorable knight type character who, for various reasons, had to take on a curse in order to save the people around him, and that curse propagated through his bloodline later on. For those of you who are into the story of this or who know Warhammer old fantasy stuff, it's the Curse of Cain, right? The first Phoenix King picks up the Sword of Cain, and his aim is to fight back these monsters from another dimension, and he decides to take on this evil power as like the price to do it. And despite succeeding, he sees like really negative consequences for doing something like that. For example, he himself becomes more ruthless and sort of careless, and no longer it just becomes more bloodthirsty. And after his death, his sort of progeny, his heirs, also suffer from that same curse. And so personally, I thought that was a really cool mechanic, the way they represented it in the actual board game. And I've always loved this idea of a character who like tries their best to help somebody, but like just through the world or just consequences of their actions, there's unintended results, or like it's almost like it's not always the most happy ending. And because everyone also loves a comeback story, right? We love the idea of somebody like falling to the ground or like falling to the lowest point in life or something and clawing their way back up, or the whole come up character arc. We all love that kind of thing. But anyway, kind of like what I was talking about before, what I'm doing now is I'm getting close to being able to actually close off this mesh, right? It's hard to imagine how you'll close it off when you're just dealing with front faces. But as soon as you start having like a full sort of more fuller three-dimensional view of it, you can start imagining where this mesh will close off. And at this point, I've already figured out, okay, I have the head down, I have the forehead and sort of the feather mane at the top here down. I think I'm going to end up closing this mesh at the bottom around the neck, or like the end of the mane towards the start of its neck. And so that's what you see me doing here, right? I'm extending down and I'm starting to build that bottom mane as a connection point for the actual neck and body, because I'm going to be doing the body separately, because like it's really hard to model all of these off one mesh. So I haven't gotten that skilled yet. If you are, please let me know or give me some tips, or just send me some other YouTubers who are doing really great work, or if I find anybody, I'll share it with you. But for me personally, when I was doing this particular project, I knew that I was going to close off this particular mesh at the bottom around the neck. And that's what you see me doing here. Now I've selected all the faces and I've extruded, and I've actually extruded down the middle, because with the mirror modifier, when you turn on clipping, any vertices that connect down the middle point of the mirror will actually connect and become a single vertice. So I didn't actually have to use the fill function to close off this mesh, which was really cool, because I also didn't have to use the cut function to make sure that each face was like 3 or 4 edges at most, just to make Blender and printing life easier. So yeah, highly recommend using the mirror function and then extruding in towards the center of the mirror so that the vertices connect, and polish it off like that. Now that I've finished the head of this phoenix here, I think what I'm going to try and do is use the mirror modifier on the... Oh, no, that is not what I'm doing. Actually, I'm going back to positioning the helmet. Yes, my apologies. What I'm doing at this point is making the body of the Phoenix. I'll get to what I was talking about earlier, which is like mirroring an entire mesh later on in the video. I thought I'd do that at this point, but I guess I was wrong. What I'm actually doing here is I'm going to be selecting faces along the top of the helmet and then extruding it out or upwards to start making the body of the Phoenix. Now, body/neck. Now, I could have done this in multiple ways. I could have just taken another cube or another plane and just modeled a body out of that, right? And then just sort of overlap the mesh over the existing helmet and the existing Phoenix head. But my problem with that is it's hard to make that look like it's one seamless piece, right? There would be very clear sections where the body mesh overlaps the head mesh, overlaps the Phoenix head mesh, and it would look almost like, I think it looks unpolished. And so what I decided here is I realized I had to make the neck and body of this Phoenix literally come from the helmet itself, as if it was forged from the helmet as part of the whole piece. So what I did was I extruded from the top and extruded up, and then basically relied on the mirror modifier to sort of tweak, curve, and just like position the vertices in a place that looks almost like a natural arch of a bird's neck. It worked out well because the Phoenix head itself had a nice polish at the bottom of the mane, so it looks almost reasonable why it would connect that way. Now, what you just saw there was I selected a couple of faces running down from the sides of the neck into the brow of the helmet. And then I extruded out. Now, the reason I did that was I wanted I almost wanted like a section of the Phoenix's head to look like it's like underbelly. You know how like some birds or like lots of mammals almost have like a different, like, I don't know, coat on their fur around their belly leading up their neck. I wanted to use this extrusion and I wanted to use this sort of sharp edge to imply that, right? Without actually like messing up the helmet too much. And I think it worked out really beautifully because it runs this extrusion, right? You see this like sharp edge on the side of the Phoenix body. It runs along the brow, right? Around the eyebrows, where the character's eyebrows would be, out and then up into the Phoenix. And so it makes this really beautiful shape that I think blends nicely into the underlying head where you would expect it to be. That worked out really well. Now what you see me doing here is I took a basic plane and I shaped it kind of like a weird triangle, because what I want to do, and that's what you're looking at now, I want to make feathers. And I knew from the beginning that this helmet needs to be very detailed. I want a lot of geometry here. I want to really put in a lot of work and make this helmet look just like full of detail, right? And so I knew that I wanted the neck and the front body of this Phoenix to look like it has distinct feathers coming down. And so I made a single feather, right? Just taking a plane, cutting it in half, applying a mirror modifier, turning on clipping so that I can only work on one side without worrying about the other. And then made a general triangle shape and extruded it out to give it that thickness. And then once I had that single feather mesh, I'm literally like what you're looking at here. I'm just duplicating it and positioning it all around this section that I've defined as the Phoenix's neck and body. And I think that works really well, right? I personally don't think you need to spend hours making each feather like hyper unique and hyper detailed, right? You can if you want to. But personally, I think this was good enough. And I've always tried to work from a place of what is close enough, right? What is 80, 90% there, or what is detail I could leave without, because the more detail you add, the more beautiful it is. But you're adding faces, you're adding vertices, you're adding edges, you're adding more for the computer to calculate when you're actually going to do the animation later, and it might end up buffing up your render time unnecessarily, right? Like, no one wants to spend 4 hours rendering one frame when we're dealing with like 1,000 frame scene, and 1,000 frame scene could like, what is that, like maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute, yeah, something like that, right? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is don't get too caught up in the weeds of it. Start general, start blocking, and then start adding your detail. And that's where I'm at this point, right? I have the shape of the head, I have the shape of the phoenix head, and I know where everything connects. Now I'm coming back in with a third layer of mesh detail to really like polish off, right? Really make it look professional and like to a standard that I think is acceptable for my abilities. There's always going to be someone better than you out there, but as long as you're doing better than you did before, I think that's a win, right? I consider that a W. Yeah, so you're just going to see me doing this feather for a little bit. I'm literally just Control D, or like Control D duplicating, and then just positioning with G along the X and Y axis and using the viewport positioner to put it in a proper place. And I'm not worrying too hard about the overlapping meshes, because what my plan is to try and use the Boolean function, which I haven't talked about a lot yet, but the Boolean function might allow me to take overlapping meshes, cut out everything that's on the inside of the mesh, and then connect them so that it's like one piece. It's as if I modeled one piece. Varying degrees of success with right there, but that's what I'm hoping to do later. But yeah, coming back to the sort of the lore of this particular character, I really loved the imagery of the Phoenix King. Like a lot of his themes and a lot of his sort of just motifs is around like fire and light and like embers, and just like the sun, those type of things, right? And that's such a perfect foil to like what is commonly considered evil, like the shadows and darkness and like the void, And I have always personally gravitated to characters like that. Like when I play D&D, like the Paladin all the way. The Paladin is like my all-time favorite class, and I know that it's so like, I know the Paladins have like a particular sort of connotation to them or like stereotype, but who doesn't want to be like a classic knight type? When you're playing a role-playing fantasy, who doesn't want to be a kick-ass knight? My next favorite, though, I gotta say, is the bard, just for the shenanigans. And I'm hoping to make a bard for this Warhammer game, or just generally make a bard model in my style, because I find that there's not a lot of people who do this kind of like cutesy chibi style, like Arcadia Quest. I get a lot of inspiration from those games. Super Dungeon Explorer, Arcadia Quest, Chibi Forge is a great creator that you should check out. Yeah, I get a lot of inspiration from these people. Oh, Grimdark Cuteness, they're all incredible modelers. And I aspire to be kind of like that, and I want to kind of develop my own personal style in that same sort of area, in that same sort of vein, if you will. So yeah, anyway, a lot of this is like, I'm hoping that when I 3D print this, because these are no longer manifold meshes, it's not going to give me too much problem. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know 3D printing as much as I wish I did. I have a lot of friends who are in 3D printing, and honestly, this is honestly going to be like a trial and error experiment. I've been going to my library a lot to practice or just like take advantage of public services when it comes to 3D printing, and it's been incredible. Like all the people there are so smart, and they teach me a lot about just like the technology nowadays and like recycling technology for supports. It's super cool. Anyway, I'm blah-blahing a lot, but coming back to what I talked about earlier, right? You see how I just selected that mesh? I applied the modifier, both the mirror and the subdivision. And what I did was I created a circle, just a circle shape behind the helmet. And I positioned it, using R such that it was oriented the same way as a helmet. And then I applied another mirror modifier on the front feathers. But instead of just mirroring the mesh, I use the eyedropper tool to select another object to mirror around. And what that ends up doing is it uses that second selected object to make a perfect mirror. And that's how I got this effect of like having a second feather appear exactly on the opposite side of the sort of line of symmetry. Maybe I'll make another video on that just to just to be more specific on how I did that, because honestly, it really helps when you're doing character modeling. So yeah, maybe I'll make a TikTok video on that or something. I don't know. Not sure if you care for like a 2-second video on how to do it, but maybe you do. Anyway, the next piece of detail I'm doing, I have the helmet done, I have the phoenix head done, I have the phoenix body, and I've added the feather detail down the center. Now what I want to do is add the wings, right? The wings is like super iconic to the silhouette of this character model, right? So I want to make sure I get this right. And what you see me doing is taking a basic plane, and I am basically making, I don't know how to describe this. It's kind of like the skeletal bone of the wing, like the primary bone of a wing before it flares out into its sort of like finger bones, right? This is sort of like where all the feathers will emerge from, right? So I want to get that nice sort of sharp, like that arcing shape with that sharp joint point where it arcs in a different direction to really get this wing looking, at least get this sort of structural part of the wing, like the main bone of the wing looking right. And then once I'm happy with the initial face, I just select it all and extrude out again. You've seen this before. In order to give it like that thickness that I really like. And now that I've positioned it against the helmet, I'm just taking, like you've seen it before, a bunch of times before, I'm just taking vertices and just positioning them along the helmet so that it looks like they're naturally emerging from or have always been a part of the helmet underneath. And I'm okay with dealing with a little bit of like overlapping mesh here. And I'll be honest with you, as I'm remembering this part of the video, I remember I spent a lot of time to really trying to get that wing spine coming from underneath the eye socket of the helmet, because I want this helmet to really look like it's purposely built and put together, like by a smith who is also an artisan, right? Because he's making this for a king, right? It's got to be, or at least a prince or something. It's got to be well made. Now what you see me doing is putting an edge loop down the sort of center of this wing column, just to give it a little more depth, right? Just so that it doesn't look like a box that's been elongated into a wing column. I'm sharpening out the edge here and bringing it down a little bit to sort of almost give it a little more depth. But again, honestly, I'm honestly just messing around. Like, I'm just feeling it out as I go. And don't be afraid to just like try it. And if you're not happy, like scrap it, throw it away, continue, try again, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And now that I'm happy with the wing column, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a feather mesh from earlier that I used to detail out the body of the phoenix, and I'm going to extend it and modify it a little bit for a new purpose. I'm going to be using this feather mesh, but making it larger to start building out the feathers of the wings itself. And when I was making this wing, I knew that it was essentially going to be 3 pieces. It was going to be the wing column, which makes the initial structure, or like the initial shape of the wing. And then there's going to be 2 layers of feathers that fill it out and give it that, just 2 layers of feathers that make it look like a wing. So I'm working on the first layer here, the front layer. And again, I'm just I'm just copying a feather mesh and positioning it along the wing column so that it just looks like a feather, right? It's nothing new, right? It's just reusing existing work you've done before to save yourself some time. There's nothing wrong with that. And I highly recommend doing that whenever you can. But if you want to spend the time and make something super detailed, more power to you. You know, I respect that. It's a lot of work, but I respect it. Yeah. So here I am making the first layer of the wings. I knew that I needed it to almost like gradiate down in size, right? Like the top one at the top of the column is quite large. And then as it goes down the column towards the chin, it needs to sort of scale down, right? To make, just so that they don't all look the same size. That would look kind of weird. And scaling it down gives it, again, silhouettes, right? That's what I'm always talking about. It makes a beautiful silhouette that I think would be pretty recognizable if you were to just put a black texture on top of this whole thing and not see any of the underlying detail, you know? And now I'm making the second layer here. Again, at this point, I've actually applied the mirror modifier on this feather because I need to be able to, I don't actually need it perfectly symmetrical around a single line of symmetry, because you see how the feather curves upwards? With a mirror modifier wouldn't allow you to do that, which is why I've applied it, and now I'm just working with the individual vertices and just positioning them to give it that sort of curved look. But just keep in mind, I did not apply the subdivision. Once you apply a subdivision modifier, it can be a bit harder to work with because you have more vertices. Once you apply subdivision modifier, you're telling Blender, the system, hey, take this basic mesh and apply like 100 faces to it, right? To smooth it out. But with that, it means that you have to work with more vertices all at once in order to make like in order to position things smoother. But if you have the mirror modifier added to a mesh but not applied, you can use it almost as like a preview function. And then you can just continue modifying the underlying mesh without having to deal with like 100 different vertices. But for those sculptors out there, you know, people who use ZBrush or just Blender sculpting tool, maybe you obviously want more vertices because it allows you to do more things with it. And maybe I'll cover that in another video. Sculpting, it's sort of I've always been more of a box modeler. It's just how I taught myself and how I learned. But sculpting people with sculpting skills are incredible, and I have so much respect, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about that aspect of character modeling. But essentially, I'm pretty much done here because like the helmet is essentially complete, because all I have to do now is apply all my modifiers and then apply one last mirror modifier using that circle that I made earlier as the mirror object target, like the mirror target. And then this wing, like the right side wing, all those feathers down the right half of the helmet, even those plume feathers at the center, those will be duplicated perfectly around the line of symmetry on the other side. And then I'll have a full helmet. I don't do that here because I'm going to make the rest of the body in the next video, but you'll see that come together at the end. Anyway, yeah, hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully it was helpful. Maybe I think what I'll do is I'll make some specific videos on using the mirror modifier, beveling, using the subdivision modifier, using a subdivision modifier, and yeah, those might come in really handy if you just need very specifics, right? I'm always constantly looking up very tiny, minute, how do I do this? Or like, what's wrong? Why is this thing all messed up? But yeah, so thanks for sticking around if you did. I'll talk to you later, okay? Peace. Thanks for watching the video. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let me know down below what you want to see next, or just check out some of these other great videos. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.